The smell of rain and rust lingered in the narrow alley where the tiny puppy lay. His ribs pressed sharp against his thinning skin, each shallow breath rattling like a broken accordion. The world around him had grown colder with each passing day, puddles of dirty water collecting in the cracks, flies hovering, shadows stretching long and merciless as the sun began to sink behind the rooftops. He didn't cry anymore. He couldn't. His voice had burned out after nights of whimpering into silence. A silence that nobody answered. Every corner of his fragile body whispered surrender, but his eyes, half glazed, faintly shimmering, still carried a flicker of something stubborn. Hope, maybe, or the memory of warmth he had once known, pressed against his mother's heartbeat before she disappeared. When footsteps echoed at the far end of the alley, he didn't lift his head. Strangers had passed before. They had only stared, sometimes kicked, sometimes turned away. But this time something different was about to happen, something that would tilt his fading world back toward life. He had surrendered to stillness, the kind that makes the body feel less like flesh and more like stone slowly cooling in the dark. The alley around him was a cathedral of shadows, trash bins towering like silent guards, a broken neon sign at the far corner stuttering its pale blue light into the mist. The rain had stopped hours earlier, but the smell of damp cardboard and rotting food clung stubbornly to the air. When the footsteps came, they didn't startle him. He was beyond startle. They arrived like a distant drumbeat, soft leather soles against wet pavement. Slow, measured, almost cautious. A silhouette appeared at the mouth of the alley, a figure blurred by the veil of mist. For a moment, the stranger paused, peering into the dim corridor as though the shadows themselves whispered for them to turn back. Most people did, but not her. Lena hesitated, not because she hadn't seen suffering before, but because this kind of sight hits a place you can't prepare for. The shape on the ground looked so small she thought it was refuse, some scrap of cloth abandoned to rot. Only when the faintest movement caught her eye did she realize it was alive. She froze, clutching her umbrella tighter, her breath leaving in a puff of white against the cold. 1,000 thoughts rushed through her at once. Don't get involved. You'll only hurt yourself. It's probably already gone. Walk away. But beneath those thoughts, louder than reason, came something raw and simple. He's still breathing. The puppy's eyes met hers for a fraction of a second. Glassy, weak, but undeniably alive. The kind of gaze that doesn't beg, doesn't plead. It simply states, I am here, I am not finished yet. Her chest tightened. She knew this feeling too well, that stubborn spark of life in a body almost broken. She had once carried it herself, years ago when the world seemed to have decided against her. To ignore it now would be like erasing her own survival. The umbrella slipped from her hand, collapsing silently into the puddle. She dropped to her knees, rain soaking through the fabric of her jeans, her trembling hands reaching forward but stopping inches away. She was afraid to touch him, afraid that even the pressure of her fingers might shatter something fragile beyond repair. Hey, she whispered, her voice breaking on a single syllable. It was not a word meant for dogs, not a call, not a command. It was the voice one uses when speaking to something at the edge, something you're begging not to leave. The puppy did not respond with movement, only a faint exhale, a sigh so delicate it barely stirred the air. Lena exhaled too, steadying herself. She slipped her scarf from around her neck, the wool damp but warmer than concrete, and carefully slid it beneath his body. His weight shocked her, not because he was heavy, but because he felt like nothing at all, as though her arms were cradling hollow air wrapped in fur. His head lolled weakly against her wrist, and for the first time she felt a flicker of panic. What if she was too late? What if she carried him only to watch him fade in her arms? But she couldn't set him down. She couldn't leave the alley knowing she had seen and chosen silence. So she rose, clutching him close, the scarf cradling him like a fragile ember. The city outside was loud again, honking cars, voices rushing past, neon signs buzzing with electricity. People glanced at her as she emerged from the alley, this woman holding what looked like a bundle of lifeless fur. Some looked away quickly, some frowned, none stopped. She kept walking. Each step was deliberate, her heartbeat loud in her ears, her breath coming fast. She didn't know if she was running towards salvation or simply prolonging his suffering, but she refused to let the light go out while it was still flickering. The puppy shifted once against her chest. Not much, just the faintest stir, as though some hidden part of him recognized the warmth he had been starved of. His nose pressed faintly into her wrist, searching instinctively for the scent of safety. Lena swallowed hard, tears pricking hot against her eyes despite the cold night air. "You're not dying here," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Not in that alley, not alone." And with those words, whispered into the storm-soaked night, the rescue began. Lena's apartment was not much more than a single room. 4 walls painted the color of quiet resignation. The radiator clanged weakly, never quite warming the space, and the faint scent of old books and detergent lingered in the air. It was a place that held her but never really felt alive, until tonight. She kicked the door shut with her heel, clutching the puppy to her chest. Her heart was racing faster than her thoughts. She laid him carefully on the couch, the scarf still wrapped around his body like a second skin. In the light he looked even smaller, fur matted with rain, eyes sunk deep into hollows, his tiny chest fluttering in shallow waves. Her hands shook as she pulled an old towel from the closet. She wrapped him gently, afraid that if she pressed too hard she would feel nothing move beneath the fabric. Her palms hovered, then pressed down softly on his ribcage, desperate for rhythm. A faint, stubborn thud met her touch. Relief flooded her, hot and overwhelming, until she realized that relief alone would not keep him alive. She had no training, no vet nearby at this hour. Only the scraps of memory from articles she had read once about rescuing strays. Warmth, fluids, rest. She filled a bowl with lukewarm water, dipped her finger, and brushed it against his dry lips. For a moment he didn't respond. Then, with a slowness that broke her heart, his tongue flicked once, a tiny gesture that said, "I will try." Her throat tightened. She whispered, "That's it, love. Stay with me." The word love startled her. It had slipped out uninvited, raw, the kind of word you don't give to something unless you're willing to risk being broken by it. The hours that followed were a blur of trembling choices. She sat cross-legged on the floor, cradling him in her lap, holding the syringe of milk she'd rushed to buy from the corner shop minutes before closing. He resisted at first, too weak to understand, his head lolling sideways. She coaxed him drop by drop, until a thin line of milk touched his tongue. His throat worked, swallowing barely enough to matter, but enough to keep the thread of life intact. Lena barely breathed. Every sound in the room seemed louder than it should. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, the uneven whistle of the radiator. The world outside her window could have been burning, and she would not have noticed. Everything narrowed down to the rise and fall of that fragile chest in her lap. But with every hour, her fear grew sharper. She saw how close he was to the edge, how his body curled in on itself like a leaf too long without sun. She imagined waking tomorrow to find the scarf empty, the towel heavy with silence. The thought shook her so violently she pressed her forehead against his small frame, whispering again and again, "Not yet, please, not yet." At some point exhaustion dragged her down. Her eyelids burned, her back ached, but she refused to lie down. She dozed, sitting upright, her chin resting near his body so that even in sleep the faint warmth of his breath brushed against her skin. Each time she startled awake, her first instinct was to touch him, to feel for that faint heartbeat, to make sure the darkness hadn't claimed him while she drifted. She realized, somewhere between night and morning, that she was afraid not just of losing him, but of failing him. This life, so small it fit inside her scarf, had placed itself unknowingly in her hands, and she felt the weight of it like a promise carved into her bones. She was terrified. Terrified she wasn't enough. Terrified of holding something so fragile when she herself had never felt whole. But as dawn began to creep through the blinds, painting pale stripes of light across the room, the puppy stirred. Not much. Just a twitch of his paw, a faint shiver that felt like the body's way of saying, "I'm still here." Lena caught her breath, her hand covering him instinctively. The trembling in her fingers didn't stop, but this time it was less from fear and more from something else. A fragile kind of hope, delicate as glass but impossible to ignore. She pressed her lips against the top of his damp head, whispering into the stillness, We'll fight together. And for the first time in years, she felt as though her trembling hands were holding something worth saving. The nights blurred together, stitched by the sound of shallow breathing and the whisper of Lena's voice against silence. Time didn't move the way it used to, not by hours or minutes, but by the rise and fall of a fragile chest, by each swallow of milk from the syringe, by every moment she leaned down in terror, wondering if this breath would be his last. She set alarms on her phone to wake every hour, though she hardly needed them. Sleep had become a series of shallow dives, her body giving in for a few minutes, only to jolt awake with the cold fear of loss. Each time she would touch the towel, press 2 fingers to his ribs, waiting for the faint drum of life. Sometimes it came slow and uncertain, sometimes so faint she panicked, shaking him gently, until his lungs gave a ragged sigh. The air in her apartment grew heavy with the smell of damp fabric and warmed milk, a scent she came to associate with both dread and determination. She draped blankets over chairs to create a cocoon of warmth, her radiator running louder than it ever had, its metallic groans a strange kind of lullaby. In that cocoon she whispered promises. Some were practical: you'll eat, you'll grow, you'll walk. Some were desperate confessions: I can't lose you. Not now, not when I've finally found something worth saving. The puppy's eyes would flicker open sometimes, cloudy but searching. He didn't understand her words, but he seemed to lean toward her voice, as if sound itself anchored him to the world. When he twitched in his restless sleep, tiny whimpers slipping from his throat, she cupped him against her chest, rocking without thinking, the way one might cradle a newborn. But survival was not a straight climb upward. There were nights when he refused even a drop, his mouth slack, his tiny body limp in her palm. Those were the nights that broke her open. She would sit on the bathroom floor under the harsh yellow light, tears dripping onto the towel as she begged him to stay. Her own reflection in the mirror looked haunted, dark circles, hair unwashed, lips cracked from the dry radiator heat. Yet she never stopped. Once, in the dead of night, he went so still she thought the end had come. She pressed her ear to his side, hearing nothing but the roar of her own blood in panic. She rubbed his body quickly with the towel, whispering frantically, "Breathe, breathe." Then, just when her heart was collapsing under certainty, he gave a faint cough, a small gasp, and the breath of the world returned to him. She laughed and sobbed at once, her whole body shaking as though she too had been pulled back from the edge. Every small victory mattered. The first time he licked a few drops from her finger instead of needing the syringe, she cried again, smiling through exhaustion. The first time his paw stretched out, pushing weakly against her hand, she felt as though she was watching someone rise from the ashes. Even the simple act of opening his eyes longer than a few seconds became a triumph, a candle flickering stronger against the dark. Through those nights of thin air, Lena realized she was changing too. She had walked through her own kind of emptiness for years, days when she moved like a shadow, barely eating, barely living. Saving him wasn't just about keeping his fragile body alive. It was about reminding herself that she still had fight left inside her, that she could still give, still protect, still hope. The city outside kept moving. Horns, rain, laughter spilling from late-night bars. But in that small apartment, it was just the two of them, two broken creatures breathing into each other's silence, refusing to give in. And slowly, impossibly, the puppy began to hold on. His breath steadied, his eyes lingered longer on her. His body, though still frail, carried the faint rhythm of survival. One morning, as dawn spread a pink glow across the blinds, he lifted his head. Not much, just an inch, wobbling before dropping back. But it was enough to draw a gasp from Lena's chest. She pressed her face into the towel, tears streaking across her cheeks as she whispered, "You're coming back to me." It was in that fragile inch of movement that she saw it, the promise of more nights, more mornings, more fights won. The thin air was thickening with life again. The first true sign came one morning when the sun was spilling across the window, warming the threadbare rug where the puppy lay. Lena had left him swaddled in her scarf, his body always tucked near her feet, so she could feel every step. She had been sketching idly at the table, lines without form, her hand moving just to keep from trembling with worry, when she heard it, a sound so soft she almost missed it, a tiny whine, high-pitched and fragile, but undeniably alive. She turned sharply, her chair scraping against the floor. The puppy had shifted, his paws stretched forward clumsily, his nose twitching as though he had caught some invisible scent in the air. And then unbelievably his tail, thin and wiry though it was, gave a single. Lena's breath caught. Her hand flew to her mouth, tears already filling her eyes before she even understood why. That wag was not just movement. It was will, it was defiance, it was the smallest creature announcing to the universe, I am still here. She dropped to her knees beside him, laughter spilling out between sobs. You did it, she whispered, brushing her fingers through his matted fur. You're fighting. He blinked up at her with eyes clearer than she had yet seen, and though he could not speak, she swore there was something in them that met her own grief and gave it back as hope. From that day the recovery was uneven but unstoppable. He began to eat more eagerly, clumsy gulps that left milk dribbling down his chin. His legs, once folded beneath him like broken twigs, began to push against the towel. The first time he stood, he trembled so fiercely she thought he'd collapse, but he held for 3 seconds, 3 sacred, glorious seconds before tumbling into her waiting hands. The apartment changed with him. Where once it was filled with silence and the hum of despair, it now carried new sounds. The scratch of tiny claws on the floor, the shuffle of paws across blankets, the occasional soft bark that startled them both into laughter. Even the smell shifted. Instead of damp fabric and sour milk, the air now held the earthy warmth of living fur, the faint sweetness of kibble soaking in water, the scent of survival. But healing was not without its shadow. There were nights when fever gripped him, when his small body shook and his breaths grew ragged again. Lena would stay awake with him, pressing cool cloths against his fur, her voice raw from singing lullabies she barely remembered. Each setback dragged fear back into her bones, reminding her how close the edge still was. And yet she found herself braver with each return. She no longer trembled at every stumble. She no longer whispered apologies into the dark. Instead, she learned to steady her own breath, to meet the storm with quiet strength. It was as though the puppy's fight was teaching her how to fight too, not only for him but for herself. One evening, weeks into this fragile rebirth, Lena sat cross-legged on the floor, while the puppy clambered unsteadily across her lap. His fur had grown softer, patches of shine returning where dullness had ruled. He gnawed clumsily at her sleeve, his small teeth tugging without strength, and she laughed, a sound that startled her with its brightness. She realized then how long it had been since she had laughed without weight, how long since she had felt her chest rise, not from panic but from joy. The puppy paused in his play, looking up at her as if to say, I know what I've given back to you. The bond between them had deepened into something unspoken. He would follow her with his eyes whenever she moved, his head tilting as though memorizing her every motion. At night he curled into the crook of her arm, sighing deeply, as if her heartbeat was the only anchor he needed. And in those moments, when the city lights flickered against the blinds, Lena would whisper truths into the quiet, about her loneliness, about the days she hadn't wanted to go on, about the way saving him had reminded her that she herself had been saved once too. The heartbeat that had almost stilled in an alley was now steady, strong, and present in every corner of her home. And with each thud, Lena felt her own heart sinking, as though both had found the rhythm they had been searching for in the silence of their brokenness. It happened on a day that had begun so bright it felt like a promise. The city was washed clean from last night's rain, and sunlight streamed through the windows, scattering across the wooden floor, where the puppy now played clumsily with the frayed edge of Lena's slip. His bark had grown stronger, his steps still wobbly but filled with a courage that made her laugh every time he tumbled and tried again. For the first time in weeks she allowed herself to believe they were safe. But safety, she would learn, is never without its test. That afternoon, as she prepared his meal, she noticed the shift. At first it was so small she thought she had imagined it. The way he paused mid-step, his tail dropping, his body swaying slightly as though the floor beneath him had tilted. She knelt down quickly, her hand reaching to steady him, and felt the heat radiating off his fur. Fever again? No, worse. His breathing was sharp, uneven, each inhale catching like a knife. Her stomach dropped. No, no, not now, she whispered, gathering him into her arms. His body felt too heavy, too limp, so terribly reminiscent of that first night in the alley, that her chest seized with terror. She pressed her ear to his ribs, desperate for rhythm. The heartbeat was there, but frantic, erratic, as though it too was afraid. She moved quickly, instincts sharpened by every night she had already fought for him. A damp cloth, a quiet corner, a syringe with water, she whispered to him endlessly.
her voice shaking but steady enough to anchor them both. Still, the fear clawed at her throat. Memories of loss, of silence, of all the times life had taken more than it had given, threatened to consume her. Hours stretched like years. She rocked him gently, her tears falling onto his fur, murmuring, "I can't lose you now, not after everything. Please fight with me, just one more time." Her hands trembled the way they had that first night, but now they trembled not from doubt, but from love too fierce to let go. And then, as if the world itself had bent under the weight of her plea, he stirred, not just a twitch of his paw, the faint press of his nose against her wrist. His eyes fluttered open, cloudy at first, then clearing as they met hers. In that fragile gaze was something unexplainable, not just life, but recognition. He knew her now. He knew the hands that had carried him from death's edge. Lena's sob broke into a laugh, raw and unrestrained. Relief flooded her body like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She pressed her forehead to his, whispering through tears, you're staying with me." From that night, the tide truly turned. His strength returned faster, his steps surer, his bark brighter. Days stretched into weeks, and what had once been survival became living. He chased shadows across the rug, gnawed playfully at her fingers, tumbled into her lap with a joy so pure it filled every corner of the apartment. The silence that had haunted her for years was gone, replaced by the rhythm of claws on wood, the soft jingle of the makeshift collar she'd tied with ribbon, the sound of her own laughter echoing against the wall. And in the quiet moments, when he curled at her side and drifted into peaceful sleep, she would study him, the rise and fall of his chest, the steady heartbeat beneath her palm, and realize that the unbelievable had already happened. She had set out to save a dying puppy, but in truth, he had saved her too. The city outside carried on, cars, voices, storms, neon signs flickering against the night, but within her small apartment, time beat to a different rhythm, the steady pulse of two hearts that had once faltered, now finding their strength together. And sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she could still see that alley, the shadows, the rain, the small body, curled against cold stone. She would shiver, then look down at the warm bundle breathing beside her and smile, because she knew how close the world had come to losing him, and how close she had come to losing herself. Now neither of them walked alone, and in that, there was something stronger than survival. There was something whole. The smell of rain and rust lingered in the narrow alley, where the tiny puppy lay, his ribs pressed sharp against his thinning skin, each shallow breath rattling like a broken accordion. The world around him had grown colder with each passing day, puddles of dirty water collecting in the cracks, flies hovering, shadows stretching long and merciless. As the sun began to sink behind the rooftops, he didn't cry anymore. He could. His voice had burned out after nights of whimpering into silence, a silence that nobody answered. Every corner of his fragile body whispered surrender, but his eyes, half glazed, faintly shimmering, still carried a flicker of something stubborn, hope, maybe, or the memory of warmth he had once known, pressed against his mother's heartbeat before she disappeared. When footsteps echoed at the far end of the alley, he didn't lift his head. Strangers had passed before. They had only stared, sometimes kicked, sometimes turned away. But this time, something different was about to happen, something that would tilt his fading world back toward life. The world does not stop for suffering. Cars hummed beyond the alley, lights flickered in windows, voices drifted on the wind, but in the shadows of that forgotten street, time bent different. The puppy's breaths were shallow, his chest lifting with the faintest rhythm, as though life itself was an argument his body no longer believed in. The damp ground beneath him was unforgiving, cold concrete slick with rainwater, the faint metallic tang of rust from an abandoned pipe filling the air. He blinked once, eyes dull but still holding the smallest thread of awareness. Hunger was no longer sharp. It had dulled into an ache so constant it was almost a companion. He had stopped searching for his mother days ago. He had stopped searching for anything. Even the flies that landed on his ears and crawled across his nose no longer drew the strength for him to shake them off. He had surrendered to stillness, the kind that makes the body feel less like flesh, and more like stone slowly cooling in the dark. The alley around him was a cathedral of shadows, trash bins towering like silent guards, a broken neon sign at the far corner stuttering its pale blue light into the mist. The rain had stopped hours earlier, but the smell of damp cardboard and rotting food clung stubbornly to the air. When the footsteps came, they didn't startle him. He was beyond startle. They arrived like a distant drumbeat, soft leather soles against wet pavement, slow, measured, almost cautious. A silhouette appeared at the mouth of the alley, a figure blurred by the veil of... For a moment, the stranger paused, peering into the dim corridor as though the shadows themselves whispered for them to turn back. Most people did, but not her.
Lena hesitated, not because she hadn't seen suffering before, but because this kind of sight hits a place you can't prepare for. The shape on the ground looked so small she thought it was refuse, some scrap of cloth abandoned to rot. Only when the faintest movement caught her eye did she realize it was alive. She froze, clutching her umbrella tighter, her breath leaving in a puff of white against the cold. 1,000 thoughts rushed through her at once. Don't get involved, you'll only hurt yourself. It's probably already gone. Walk away. But beneath those thoughts, louder than reason, came something raw and simple. He's still breathing. The puppy's eyes met hers for a fraction of a second. Glassy, weak, but undeniably alive. The kind of gaze that doesn't beg, doesn't plead. It simply states, I am here. I am not finished yet. Her chest tightened. She knew this feeling too well. That stubborn spark of life in a body almost broken. She had once carried it herself years ago when the world seemed to have decided against her. To ignore it now would be like erasing her own survival. The umbrella slipped from her hand, collapsing silently into the puddles. She dropped to her knees, rain soaking through the fabric of her jeans, her trembling hands reaching forward but stopping inches away. She was afraid to touch him, afraid that even the pressure of her fingers might shatter something fragile beyond repair. Hey, she whispered, her voice breaking on a single syllable. It was not a word meant for dogs, not a call, not a command. It was the voice one uses when speaking to something at the edge, something you're begging not to leave. The puppy did not respond with movement, only a faint exhale, a sigh so delicate it barely stirred the air. Lena exhaled too, steadying herself. She slipped her scarf from around her neck, the wool damp but warmer than concrete, and carefully slid it beneath his body. His weight shocked her, not because he was heavy but because he felt like nothing at all, as though her arms were cradling hollow air wrapped in fur. His head lolled weakly against her wrist, and for the first time she felt a flicker of panic. What if she was too late? What if she carried him only to watch him fade in her arms? But she couldn't set him down. She couldn't leave the alley knowing she had seen and chosen silence. So she rose, clutching him close, the scarf cradling him like a fragile ember. The city outside was loud again, honking cars, voices rushing past, neon signs buzzing with electricity. People glanced at her as she emerged from the alley, this woman holding what looked like a bundle of lifeless fur. Some looked away quickly. Some frowned. None stopped. She kept walking. Each step was deliberate. Her heartbeat loud in her ears, her breath coming fast. She didn't know if she was running toward salvation or simply prolonging his suffering. But she refused to let the light go out while it was still flickering. The puppy shifted once against her chest. Not much, just the faintest stir, as though some hidden part of him recognized the warmth he had been starved of. His nose pressed faintly into her wrist, searching instinctively for the scent of safety. Lena swallowed hard, tears pricking hot against her eyes. Despite the cold night air, "You're not dying here," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Not in that alley, not alone. And with those words whispered into the storm-soaked night, the rescue began. The night carried her forward like a current she couldn't step out of. The city around her blurred into streaks of sound and light, neon bleeding into puddles, headlights bending across slick asphalt. Lena held the fragile bundle against her chest, feeling the faint throb of his heartbeat through the damp wool scarf, each irregular beat a desperate argument against silence. Her breath came sharp, frosting in the cold air. She moved quickly, not quite running but too fast for calm. The scarf clung wet to her arms, and she tried not to imagine what she felt beneath it. The sharp bones pressing against her forearm, the heat that came not from strength but from fever. She fought the thought that he might die before she even reached help. The clinic was 2 streets away, a place she had passed 100 times but never entered. Its windows glowed with sterile light, a haven that looked almost holy now against the grime of the street. She pressed through the door and the sound of the city cut off like a curtain falling. Inside, the world smelled of antiseptic and something faintly sweet. the smell of clean that belonged to survival. The receptionist's head lifted, her practiced calm faltering when she saw the bundle in Lena's arms. "Emergency," Lena gasped before the woman could ask. "Please." Her throat caught, but she didn't need to finish. The woman was already on her feet, waving her toward the back. They moved quickly, hands reaching, voices soft but urgent. A table was cleared, the scarf unwrapped, and the tiny body laid bare under the bright white glare of the lamp. For a heartbeat, Lena wanted to pull him back into her arms, shield him from the cold light. But she forced herself to step aside. Her hands shook as she gripped the edge of the counter, the metal biting into her palms, grounding her against the wave of helplessness rising in her chest. The veterinarian arrived, a man in his 40s with eyes that carried both exhaustion and unshaken focus. He didn't waste words. His hands moved steady and sure, checking breath, heartbeat, gums. Each motion was precise, practiced. But Lena caught the flicker of worry in his furrowed brow. "He's severely malnourished," the vet murmured, almost to himself. "Dehydrated, hypothermic." He glanced up at Lena. "But he's still fighting. That's something. Still fighting." The words clung to her like a lifeline. She nodded too quickly, tears burning at the corners of her eyes. "Do whatever you have to. Please. Just don't let him go." The vet gave a brief nod, then returned to work. Tubes, fluids, the soft click of machines coming to life. A heating pad was slid beneath the puppy's frail body, a thin blanket tucked gently over him. One nurse cupped his tiny muzzle, coaxing the smallest trickle of liquid past his lips. His throat convulsed weakly, but he swallowed. The room exhaled in quiet relief. Lena's chest trembled. She pressed her fist against her lips to hold back a sob, but it broke free anyway, shattering in the quiet room. She turned away, ashamed of the sound, but the nurse touched her shoulder gently. "Crying's allowed," she whispered. Lena laughed through the tears, a broken, breathless sound. She hadn't realized until that moment how tightly she had been holding herself together, as though her own stillness was the only thing keeping him tethered. But now, surrounded by people who moved with skill and care, she let go just enough to breathe again. Minutes blurred into an hour. The puppy's body remained frighteningly still, his breaths shallow but steadier now, his fragile chest rising against the warmth. Lena sat in the corner, knees drawn to her chest, the damp of her clothes chilling her skin but her arms wrapped tightly as if holding the absence of his weight. She watched every flicker of the monitors, every careful touch of the vet's hands, as though memorizing the steps of a ritual that could call life back from the brink. And then the smallest sound, a sigh, rough and raspy, but more alive than before. The puppy's paw twitched against the blanket, a faint, uncoordinated movement, but one that made Lena sit upright, her heart leaping painfully against her ribs. She leaned forward, barely daring to speak. "He moved," she whispered. The vet glanced at her, his expression softening. "Yeah, he's not giving up." Lena pressed her hands to her mouth, her eyes flooding again. She wanted to reach across the room, to scoop him back into her arms, and promise him the world. But she held herself back, because for the first time, she realized, this wasn't about her need to save him. It was about giving him the chance to save himself. The room settled into a rhythm, the hum of machines, the steady drip of fluids, the low murmur of voices. Outside, the night deepened, the city carrying on in its unrelenting pace. But inside the clinic, time curled around the fragile body of a puppy, who had been only days from dying. And in that fragile space, beneath the white glare of the lamp and the soft hum of machines, something unbelievable had begun. Weeks stretched into months, and what began as a trembling breath in the shadows of an alley grew into a heartbeat that filled Lena's small apartment with life. The puppy, once skeletal and silent, learned the weight of his own steps, stumbling first on weak legs, then bounding across the worn carpet with clumsy joy. His fur thickened, soft beneath her hands, and the dull glaze of his eyes gave way to a warm brown light that followed her wherever she went. There were nights she woke to the sound of his breathing beside her bed, steady and unbroken, and she would lie there in the quiet, tears slipping silently into her pillow, because she remembered too vividly the silence of that alley, a stillness that had nearly swallowed him. Every inhale he drew now
felt like a victory. She named him Ash, after the grey that once covered him, after the fire that refused to go out even when it was buried in darkness. And Ash became her shadow, her confidant, her proof that survival could be rewritten into something radiant. Together they carved out a rhythm of walks beneath the morning sun, playful battles with blankets, quiet evenings where his head rested against her knee. But the truest change was inside her. Saving him had been more than rescue. It had been a miracle. She had once known what it felt like to be left in her own kind of alley, unseen and nearly undone. Bringing him back was like bringing back the part of herself that had almost given up. One evening, months later, she returned to that same alley. Ash trotted beside her, stronger now, his coat glistening beneath the amber glow of the streetlights. He paused at the entrance, nose twitching at the scents, ears alert. Lena stood still, her breath caught in her throat. The place was the same, damp concrete, rust, the hum of neon. But the weight of it had shifted. It was no longer a tomb, it was the birthplace of something miraculous. She crouched, stroking Ash's head, and whispered into the night, not to the shadows but to the memory of who they both had been. We made it. Ash pressed his nose into her palm, warm and alive, his tail brushing lightly against her leg. And for a moment, a city noise fell away, the world holding its breath around them. A puppy who had been only days from dying was now pulling her forward, step by step, toward the light of tomorrow. And as they walked away from the alley together, the last thing she noticed was the sound, his paws tapping against the pavement, steady and sure, like the heartbeat of hope refusing to fade.